The Hall of the Concord was the largest structure ever built by any living species in the known galaxy. And on this particular morning, it was filled with over 6,000 delegates from across 4,200 civilizations. All of them seated in their respective pods, all of them watching, listening, and waiting for the next speaker to take the stage. Ambassador Rael Vasquez of Earth stepped forward, her boots clicking against the smooth crystalline floor, and she smiled politely at the assembly before beginning her address on the matter of interstellar trade routes near the Orion Corridor. She spoke calmly and clearly, the way humans always did when they were in no rush, and the translation systems carried her words to every corner of the vast chamber. Most of the delegates listened with respect, some even with admiration, but if one looked closely enough, one could see something else in the eyes of many alien representatives. A quiet unease, distance, as though they were sitting near something powerful that they did not fully understand. And perhaps they were right to feel that way. In the upper observation gallery, far above the main floor, a four-armed Velishari scholar named Torvan sat beside his young apprentice, a nervous creature barely out of academy training. And together, they watched the human ambassador speak. "She seems so calm," the apprentice whispered, his slender fingers gripping his datapad. Torvan let out a slow breath through his twin nostrils and nodded. "They are always calm," he replied quietly. "That is what makes them terrifying." The apprentice blinked all four of his eyes and tilted his head in confusion. "Terrifying?" he asked. "But the humans are kind. Everyone says so. They trade fairly, they keep their promises, they help smaller species, and they have never started a war with anyone in the Concord." Torvan looked at the young one for a long moment, and then leaned back in his seat. "Let me tell you a story," he said softly. "When humanity first made contact with the galaxy 87 years ago, every major intelligence service in the Concord began studying their world, their history, their biology, their culture, everything, and what they found made every single one of them go very, very quiet." He paused and folded two of his forearms across his chest. "Earth is what we classify as a death world," he continued. "High gravity, extreme weather, an atmosphere that shifts between burning heat and freezing cold depending on where you stand, oceans that swallow ships whole, ground that shakes and splits open without warning, and a biosphere filled with millions of species, all competing to eat each other." The apprentice swallowed hard. "And the humans survived all of that?" he asked. "They did more than survive," Torvan said, his voice dropping even lower. "They conquered it. Every mountain, every ocean, every desert, every jungle. And when they ran out of things on their world to overcome, they turned on each other." He tapped his datapad and pulled up a file. Old records, translated from human archives. "They fought wars that killed millions," he said. "They built weapons that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light. They called them nuclear bombs, and they actually used them, twice, on their own kind." The apprentice stared at the datapad, his face pale. "They developed poisons that could kill everything breathing in a whole region. Diseases designed in laboratories to wipe out populations, and machines built only for the purpose of ending life as efficiently as possible. And all of this they did to each other, long before they ever knew the rest of the galaxy existed." Torvan closed the file and looked back down at the human ambassador, who was now smiling warmly at a Kelnori delegate and shaking his hand. Torvan said, "After all of that, after centuries of blood and fire and destruction, they did not collapse. They did not go extinct. Instead, they rebuilt, they learned, they united, and they came out into the stars as one people, scarred but unbroken." The apprentice was silent for a long time. "So the rule," he finally said, "the one everyone talks about, but no one writes down." "Yes," Torvan said simply, You do not touch Earth. That is the rule. Not because of a treaty, not because of any weapon or shield, but because every species that has ever studied humanity has come to the same conclusion. If you go to war with them, they will not stop. They will not surrender. They will not negotiate until the threat is gone, and they have 10,000 years of practice at being the most dangerous thing on their own world. Far away from the Hall of the Concord, on the edge of known space, in a region the star maps marked in red, a very different kind of gathering was taking place. The Draxari Dominion was a militaristic empire built by a species of tall, scaled, cold-blooded reptilian warriors who had spent the last 3 centuries conquering their neighbors one by one. Their throne world of Kashar was a dark and brutal place, a planet of volcanic rock and iron fortresses. And in the deepest chamber of the central war citadel, a young warlord sat upon a throne made from the bones of fallen enemies. His name was Sethrak, and he was the youngest supreme commander the Dominion had ever known. Barely 40 cycles old, ambitious beyond measure, and utterly convinced that the galaxy belonged to the strong. Around him stood his war council, 12 senior commanders, most of them old and battle-scarred, and they watched in tense silence as Sethrak studied a holographic map of the galaxy. "Here," he said, his clawed finger tapping a small blue star on the map. "Sol system, the human homeworld, rich in resources, perfectly positioned between 3 major trade corridors, and defended by a fleet that has not seen real combat in decades." One of the elder commanders, a grizzled veteran named Drothal, shifted uncomfortably. "Supreme Commander," he said carefully, "the humans are not to be underestimated. Their reputation—" "Their reputation is a story," Sethrak interrupted, his yellow eyes narrowing. "A myth, a legend built on fear and nothing more. They fought each other with primitive weapons on a single planet centuries ago, and somehow the entire galaxy decided to be afraid of them forever." He stood from his throne, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the war table. "I have conquered 6 species," he declared. 6, and every single one of them begged for mercy within days. The humans will be no different. Drothal opened his mouth to speak again, but the look in Sethrak's eyes silenced him. Continued, pacing now, his tail sweeping the floor behind him. "The Concord talks and debates and negotiates, while real power slips away. But we are Draxari. We do not ask, we take." He turned back to the map and stared at the small blue dot that was Earth. "Mobilize the swarm fleets," he commanded, his voice cold and final. "All 400 warships, full assault configuration. We strike Earth and we strike fast, before the Concord can even hold a vote." The War Council exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to object. Drothal looked at the map one last time, at that small blue world so far away, and a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold air of the Citadel. He had read the old files, the ones from the intelligence archives that most young officers never bothered to open, and he knew something that Sethrak did not. The humans had a saying, an old one from their darkest centuries, and it went like this: "Dogs lie." And Sethrak, in all his arrogance and pride, was about to kick the biggest, most dangerous dog the galaxy had ever seen. The order was given. The fleets began to move, and somewhere in the cold silence of space, the machinery of war hummed to life once more. Earth, in the year 2347, was a world reborn, green and blue and alive with the energy of 14 billion souls who had spent centuries healing the scars their ancestors had left behind. Megacities rose like silver towers above forests that stretched for thousands of miles, and orbital rings circled the planet like glowing necklaces in the sky, and space elevators carried people and cargo between the surface and the stars with the ease of a morning commute. It was a Tuesday when everything changed. Captain Idris Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the orbital carrier EDS Prometheus, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark eyes scanning the quiet holographic displays that showed the space around Earth in peaceful blue light. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, and calm in the way that soldiers who had trained their entire lives tended to be. And he had served in the United Earth Defense Command for 22 years without ever firing a weapon in real combat. The UEDC was enormous. Thousands of ships, millions of personnel, bases on every continent and every moon in the solar system. But it had not fought a real war in living memory. Some people called it ceremonial, a relic of a more dangerous time. And Okonkwo had heard the jokes more than once. The biggest army in the galaxy with nothing to do. His first officer, Lieutenant Commander Priya Sharma, liked to say with a grin. But Okonkwo never laughed at that joke, because deep in his bones, he carried the same instinct that every human soldier carried. The quiet knowledge that peace was never permanent, that the calm was always temporary, and that one day the alarm would sound. On this Tuesday, at exactly 14 minutes past 11 in the morning, Earth Standard Time, it did. The sensor officer screamed first, a sharp, raw sound that cut through the silence of the bridge like a blade. Contact. Multiple contacts. 400 plus. Signatures dropping out of hyperspace. They are inside the lunar perimeter. Repeat, they are inside the lunar perimeter. Okonkwo felt the blood drain from his face, but his body moved before his mind could catch up, and he was already at the tactical console, his fingers flying across the controls. Classification, he demanded. Drakhari, the officer replied, her voice shaking. Drakhari's sworn fleet. Full war configuration. They bypassed every outer sensor net. They must have used some kind of phase cloak technology. Captain, they are already in Earth orbit. For 3 heartbeats, the bridge was silent. Then, the first explosions hit. The Drakhari fleet opened fire without warning, without demands, without any attempt at communication. 418 warships unleashing concentrated plasma bombardment directly at the surface of the Earth. Sao Paulo was hit first, a city of 38 million people, and in a single blinding flash, the entire downtown core vanished in a column of fire that rose so high it could be seen from orbit. Lagos was hit 7 seconds later. Shanghai was hit 4 seconds after that. In the first 90 seconds of the attack, 2,300,000 human beings were dead. On the bridge of the Prometheus, alarms screamed from every console, and the main display showed the planet below wreathed in smoke and fire, and for one terrible moment, nobody moved. Then Okonkwo spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of something ancient and unbreakable. Stations, he said. That single word moved through the ship like an electric current, and every officer on the bridge snapped to their positions as though a switch had been thrown inside them. Across the planet, across the solar system, across every station and outpost and colony where humans lived and breathed, the same transformation was happening. Emergency networks activated in cascading waves, military channels lit up with traffic, civilian broadcast systems switched to wartime protocols, and a message went out on every frequency, in every language, to every corner of human civilization. The message was simple. Earth was under attack. And then something happened that the Drakshari had not expected, something that no species in the galaxy had ever truly witnessed, because no one had been foolish enough to trigger it in almost a century. Humanity woke up, not slowly, not in confusion, not in panic, but with a speed and coordination that defied everything the galaxy thought it knew about organic civilizations. Within 6 minutes, every active UEDC vessel in the solar system had received orders and was moving to combat positions. Within 9 minutes, every reservist on Earth had been contacted and given a rally point. Within 11 minutes, just 11 minutes after the first bombs fell, the planetary defense AI, known as Aegis, completed its shift from peacetime monitoring to full wartime operations, and its cold, synthetic voice echoed across every military channel with words that had not been spoken in over 80 years. Aegis Protocol 7 is now active. All defense systems are online. Earth is at war. Across the galaxy, every species with access to the Concord Relay Network watched the attack unfold in real time. In the hall of the Concord on Erythale Prime, the delegates sat in frozen horror as the footage played on the central display. The burning cities, the orbital explosions, the Draxhari fleet hanging over Earth like a swarm of dark locusts. Torvan, the Velashari historian, was in the gallery when the news broke, and his datapad slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor, and all four of his arms went limp at his sides. "They attacked Earth," he whispered, and his voice was barely audible over the growing murmur of the assembly. "Actually attacked Earth." His apprentice stood beside him, trembling. "What happens now?" the young one asked. Torvan did not answer immediately, because his mind was racing through every file he had ever read, every record, every piece of human history he had spent his career studying, and all of it led to the same conclusion. "Now," he said finally, his voice hollow, "now we find out if the stories were true." Across the chamber, a Kelnori diplomat, a tall, thin insectoid creature with iridescent wings, turned to his aide and spoke in a voice that was not sad or sympathetic, but deeply and fundamentally afraid. "The Draxhari have no idea what they have just awakened," he said. His aide looked at him with wide, compound eyes. "Should we send help?" the aide asked. The diplomat let out a sound that was almost a laugh, but had no humor in it. "Help the humans?" he said. "No. If anything, we should be thinking about how to help the Draxhari, because what is coming for them will be unlike anything this galaxy has ever seen. On Earth, the fire still burned, and the dead were still being counted, but something had changed in the air, something invisible, and ancient, and terrifying. Every human who heard the news felt it, a cold, hard thing settling into their chest, a weight that their ancestors would have recognized instantly, because it had lived in human blood for 10,000 years. It was not fear. It was not grief. Not yet. Grief would come later, in the quiet hours, in the memorials, in the long nights after the fighting was done. What filled humanity in that moment was something far older and far more dangerous. It was purpose. Mothers kissed their children and walked to the nearest enlistment center without looking back. Retired soldiers opened closets they had not touched in decades and pulled out uniforms that still fit because they had never stopped training. Not really. Not deep down where it mattered. Engineers who built bridges and towers and gardens looked at their tools and saw weapons, and their hands did not shake. Factory lines that made consumer goods began switching to military production, and the workers on those lines did not need to be told what to do, because their grandparents had told them stories, and their grandparents before them, all the way back to the first human who ever picked up a rock to defend their family. Captain Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Prometheus as it moved into battle formation, and he looked at the Draxhari fleet on his display, and he felt the weight in his chest, and he understood it. The galaxy thought humanity was kind, and they were right. The galaxy thought humanity was peaceful, and they were right about that too. But the galaxy had forgotten, or perhaps had never truly understood, that human kindness was a choice, and human peace was a discipline. Underneath both of those things, buried deep but never gone, was the thing that had kept humanity alive through ice ages and plagues and wars, and every other nightmare their brutal world had thrown at them. It was the ability to look at something that wanted to destroy them, to feel the fire and the pain and the loss, and to say with absolute certainty, "No, not us, not today, not ever." And then to make it true, no matter the cost. The first 72 hours of the war changed the way every species in the galaxy understood the word human. Warlord Sethrak stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Iron-Scale Dominion, and watched his tactical displays with growing disbelief, as the situation around Earth refused to follow the pattern he had seen 6 times before. When the Draxhari had conquered the Pelori surrendered in 2 days. When they crushed the Milani, it took 3. When they broke the Vreth Collective, the Vreth leaders were begging for terms before the first ground troops even landed. Earth was supposed to be the same. A quick strike, overwhelming force, shattered morale, and then submission. Instead, what Sethrak saw on his displays was something that made his cold reptilian blood run even colder. Across the dark side of Earth's moon, massive panels of rock and dust were sliding apart to reveal weapon platforms that had been buried beneath the surface for decades. Railguns the size of city blocks, missile batteries arranged in honeycomb clusters, and energy projectors that began charging with a deep hum that could be felt through the vacuum of space itself. On Earth's orbital ring, sections that had appeared to be civilian infrastructure folded open like the petals of some terrible flower, revealing row after row of torpedo launchers and point defense turrets that came online in a rippling cascade of activation lights. Hidden among the thousands of civilian satellites that circled the planet, hundreds of disguised weapons platforms dropped their false shells and began targeting Draxhari vessels with laser designators. Humanity had never been unarmed. They had simply been quiet about it. Sethrak slammed his fist against the railing of his command deck. Why was none of this in the intelligence reports? He snarled at his officers. None of them had an answer, because the truth was simple. Intelligence service in the galaxy had ever gotten close enough to Earth's inner defense grid to know what was hidden there, because no one had ever been foolish enough to try. The Battle of High Orbit began at hour 14, and it was unlike anything the Draxhari had ever experienced. The UEDC fleet was outnumbered roughly 3-1, but numbers meant very little when the smaller force fought the way humans fought. Captain Okonkwo led his battle group straight into the center of the Draxhari formation, and the alien commanders expected the human ships to hold at range and exchange fire in the traditional manner, the way every civilized species fought in space, with careful distance and calculated volleys. Instead, the human ships accelerated directly into the gaps between Draxhari vessels, closing to point-blank range where the larger alien warships could not maneuver their heavy weapons fast enough to track the smaller, faster human craft. By galactic standards, no species willingly closed to knife-fighting distance in space combat. But the humans did it without hesitation, and the reason was devastatingly simple. Humans had evolved on a world where every predator attacked at close range, where survival meant getting inside the reach of something bigger and meaner, and finding the soft spot. And 10,000 years of that instinct did not disappear just because the battlefield moved to the stars. Draxhari ships began taking hits from directions they could not defend. Torpedoes launched at ranges so short the point defense systems could not react in time. Energy weapons fired into engine ports and shield generators at angles that should have been impossible. And then came the boarding parties. The first Draxhari warship to be boarded was the heavy cruiser Thalan's Fury, and what happened inside its corridors would become one of the most talked-about events in galactic military history. Of 60 human marines in powered combat armor breached the hull through a torpedo impact point and stormed into the ship's interior. And the 300 Draxhari soldiers inside expected to cut them down easily because the Draxhari were larger, stronger in raw physical terms, and armed with plasma rifles designed to punch through heavy armor. What they did not expect was the way the humans moved. The Marines came through the corridors like water flowing downhill, fast, adaptive, covering every angle, and they used the tight spaces to their advantage in ways the Draxhari could not counter. Humans had spent centuries perfecting the art of close-quarters combat, fighting in trenches, in buildings, in tunnels, in jungles, in every confined and miserable space their violent history had forced them into. And that experience was coded into their training at a level that no other species could match. The Draxhari soldiers were brave, but bravery was not enough. Against an enemy that could read the flow of a fight the way a river reads the shape of its banks. Within 40 minutes, the Fallon's fury was under human control, and the surviving Draxhari crew was locked in their own cargo hold, staring at each other in stunned silence. On the ground, things were even worse for the invaders. Sethrak had ordered ground troops to land in the ruins of Sao Paulo, expecting to find a broken and demoralized civilian population that would offer no resistance. What they found instead was a nightmare. Within hours of the initial bombardment, the surviving population of the Sao Paulo metropolitan region had organized itself into a functioning resistance network, not because someone told them to, but because humans had an instinct for this kind of thing that ran deeper than training or orders. Neighborhood defense groups formed spontaneously, coordinating through personal communication devices that the Draxhari jamming systems could not suppress. Could not fully suppress because human engineers had built redundancy into their networks, the way other species built redundancy into their life support. Obsessively, and with the assumption that everything would eventually try to fail. Civilians who had never held a weapon in their lives picked up whatever they could find and fought back with a fury that shocked the Draxhari ground commanders. An old woman threw a homemade incendiary device from a fourth-floor window and destroyed a Draxhari armored transport. A group of teenagers used construction drones to collapse a building onto a column of enemy soldiers. A retired engineer rigged the entire city water system to flood a Draxhari underground command post. The Draxhari field commander, a scarred veteran named Kolthar, sent a transmission back to the fleet that was intercepted by every intelligence service in the Concord. "These creatures do not flee," his voice said, cracking with something that sounded very much like fear. "They do not hide. They do not beg. They are everywhere, and they are angry. I have fought 7 campaigns on 7 worlds, and I have never seen anything like this. They are not soldiers. They are civilians. And they fight as though losing is not something they have ever considered possible." In the hall of the Concord, the delegates watched the battle reports come in, and the mood shifted from shock to something deeper and more complicated. A Thalani diplomat, a species known for their cold logic and emotional detachment, stood and addressed the emergency session. "We must consider intervention," she said, her crystalline voice ringing through the chamber. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. "Not to help Earth," she clarified, and her next words silenced the room. "To contain what the humans are about to do. If we allow this war to run its course without mediation, the Drakkari Dominion will not simply lose, it will cease to exist, and the precedent that sets will reshape the balance of power in this galaxy for centuries." The Kelnori ambassador nodded slowly. "She is correct," he said. "I have studied every war humanity has ever fought, and there is a pattern. When they are attacked without provocation, when their civilians are killed, when their homes are burned, they do not seek peace, they seek victory, total, absolute, and irreversible victory. And they have the will and the means to achieve it." He looked around the chamber at the thousands of alien faces staring back at him. "The Draxhari killed 2,300,000 humans in 90 seconds, he said quietly. "And right now, every single human being alive, all 14 billion of them, knows the exact number. They are counting their dead, and they are remembering every name, and when humans remember, they do not forget." Back on the bridge of the Prometheus, Captain Okonkwo watched as the Draxhari formation began to buckle under the relentless human assault, and he allowed himself one slow breath before giving his next order. "Push them back," he said. "Push them out of our sky. This is our home, and they are not welcome here." The fleet surged forward, and the Draxhari began to break. Sethrak watched from his flagship as ship after ship reported critical damage, as his ground forces sent desperate calls for extraction, as the orbital defense platforms continued to fire with mechanical precision that never wavered and never stopped. For the first time in his life, the young warlord felt something he had never felt before, something his conquered enemies had felt many times, but that he had always dismissed as weakness. It was the realization that he had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. But his pride would not let him say the word retreat. And so the battle continued, and Earth burned, and the humans fought with a cold and terrifying fury that would echo through galactic history for 1,000 years to come. 2 weeks after the first bombs fell on Earth, the galaxy learned something new about humanity, something that frightened the Concorde even more than the battle in orbit had. Humans did not just defend, they struck back. The speed of it was what shook every military analyst in known space, because mobilizing a full interstellar war fleet was supposed to take months, even for the most advanced civilizations, and yet the humans had done it in 14 days. 14 days from burning cities to a fully operational offensive fleet numbering over 600 warships, crewed by soldiers who had been factory workers and teachers and engineers just 2 weeks before, supported by a logistics chain that stretched from Earth to the edge of the solar system and beyond. They called it Operation Requiem, and the name was not chosen by accident. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka sat in the cockpit of her strike fighter aboard the stealth destroyer EDS Ghost of Nanking as it slipped through Draxhari space on the far side of the border, running silent with engines at minimum output and every non-essential system powered down. She was 31 years old, a combat pilot who had trained for 12 years and never seen real action until the day the sky over Earth turned to fire. And now she was deep behind enemy lines with 47 other pilots preparing for a raid on a Draxhari supply depot that fed their remaining fleet operations. On the small display beside her flight controls, a list of names scrolled slowly upward. 2,300,000 names, and she had set it to scroll continuously, day and night, so that she would never forget why she was here. Her squadron leader's voice came through the calm and steady. "All wings, we are 30 minutes from the target. Check your systems, check your wingmates, and remember the briefing. We hit the depot, we destroy their fuel reserves, and we get out clean. Unnecessary risks. We are not here to die. We are here to make sure they cannot fight." Tanaka checked her weapons, confirmed her targeting data, and took one slow breath. The raid on the Draxhari supply depot at Verath Station was over in 11 minutes, and when it was done, the station was a drifting wreck, and 42,000 tons of fuel and ammunition had been reduced to expanding clouds of glowing debris. It was one of 17 such raids carried out on the same day, across 7 different star systems, all coordinated to the second by the Aegis War Intelligence Network back on Earth. The humans were not just fighting a war, they were dismantling the Draxhari war machine, piece by piece, with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. And everywhere they went, they broadcast the same message on all frequencies, in every language the Draxhari and their vassal species could understand. "Return our dead, surrender your warlord, or we keep." That message echoed across Draxhari space like a drumbeat, and it did something that no amount of firepower could have achieved on its own. It planted fear in the hearts of every species allied with the Dominion. The Draxhari had built their empire on conquest, and their vassal species, the Pelori, the Vreth, the Milani, and 3 others, had submitted out of fear of Draxhari military power. But now there was something more frightening than the Draxhari in the galaxy, and it was coming closer every day. The Pelori were the first to break, Their ambassador appeared on the Concord Relay Network and announced that the Pelori Confederation was withdrawing from the Draxhari Dominion effective immediately, and that all Pelori military forces were standing down and would not oppose human fleet movements through their space. 2 days later, the Vreth Collective did the same. Then, the Milani. One by one, Sethrak's allies abandoned him, not because they suddenly believed in justice or freedom, but because they had done the math, and the math was very clear. Standing between the humans and their target was the most dangerous place in the galaxy to be. Sethrak raged in his war citadel on Kashar, surrounded by maps that showed his empire shrinking by the hour. His fleet battered and retreating, his supply lines cut, and his allies gone. "Cowards," he snarled, sweeping a pile of reports off his war table. "Every one of them, cowards and traitors." Old Drothal stood in the corner of the room, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say. He had warned Sethrak, and Sethrak had not listened, and now the consequences were arriving with the inexorable certainty of gravity. The elder commander looked at his warlord and saw not a conqueror, but a young fool who had kicked a hornet's nest and was now watching the swarm descend. On Arithel Prime, the Galactic Concord scrambled to find a diplomatic solution before the situation spiraled beyond any hope of containment. They chose an unlikely envoy. Torvan, the Velashari historian, pressed into diplomatic service because he was one of the few non-human scholars who had spent his entire career studying humanity, and might be able to speak to them in a way they would respect. Torvan traveled to Earth aboard a Concord diplomatic vessel, and when he arrived in orbit, he looked down at the planet through the observation window, and felt his hearts, both of them, ache at what he saw. The scars of the bombardment were still visible, dark patches where cities had burned, haze in the atmosphere from fires that had taken days to control, and a ring of debris in orbit where the battle had been fiercest. But he also saw something else. Construction drones already at work rebuilding, cargo ships moving in organized streams between the surface and orbit, and the unmistakable signs of a civilization that was not broken, not even close, but was simply channeling its grief into motion. He was escorted to the diplomatic wing of the UEDC headquarters in Geneva and led to a conference room where Ambassador Raul Vasquez was waiting for him. She looked tired. There were shadows under her eyes and a tension in her jaw that had not been there the last time he had seen her in the hall of the Concord. But she smiled when she saw him and gestured for him to sit. "Torvan," she said, "it is good to see you. I wish it were under better circumstances." "As do I, Ambassador," he replied, settling his large frame into a chair that was slightly too small for him. "I come on behalf of the Concord with a proposal for a ceasefire. The Council believes that the Draxhari Dominion has been sufficiently weakened, and that continued military action risks destabilizing the entire region." Vasquez poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for Torvan, who had developed a palpable attitude to sitting in the seat. Fondness for the human drink during his years of research, and she slid his cup across the table before responding. "We appreciate the Concord's concern," she said, and her voice was polite, but carried an edge of something that Torvan recognized as controlled anger. "But I want to be clear about something. We did not start this war. We did not provoke it. We did not want it. 418 Draxhari warships entered our system without warning and killed 2,300,000 of our people in 90 seconds. She paused and took a sip of her coffee. "We will stop fighting when 3 conditions are met," she continued. 1. The Draxhari return the remains of every human killed in the bombardment that they have in their possession. 2. Warlord Sethrak is surrendered to human custody to face trial for crimes against humanity. 3. The Draxhari Dominion formally acknowledges responsibility for the unprovoked attack and agrees to reparations. Torvan nodded slowly. "And if those conditions are not met?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Vasquez looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw the same thing he had seen in every piece of human history he had ever studied. A will that did not bend, did not break, and did not tire. "Then we keep coming," she said simply, "until they are met." Torvald sat with those words for a long moment, and something shifted inside him. A final piece of understanding, falling into place after decades of study. He had always known that humans were strong, and resilient, and dangerous when provoked. But sitting across from this tired woman, with her cup of coffee and her unbreakable resolve, he finally understood the thing that made humanity truly terrifying. It was not their weapons, though those were formidable. It was not their ships, though those were fast and deadly. It was not their numbers, though 14 billion was an enormous population by galactic standards. It was that they remembered. Every name, every face, every life lost. They carried it all with them, not as a burden, but as fuel, not as grief alone, but as purpose. And they would not stop, could not stop, until the debt was paid. Not with blood, they were not savages, but with justice. And that, Torvald realized, was the most frightening thing of all. Because blood debts could be settled, and rage could burn itself out, but a demand for justice was patient and relentless, and would follow you to the ends of the galaxy and beyond. He picked up his coffee, took a long sip, and set the cup down carefully. "I will relay your terms to the Concord," he said quietly. "Thank you, Torvald," Vasquez replied, and her smile was sad but genuine. "I hope they listen. I truly do, because we do not want to destroy the Draxari. We never wanted any of this, but we will not let what happened go unanswered." Torvald stood, and as he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Ambassador," he said, "for what it is worth, in all my years studying your species, I have never been more impressed by humanity than I am right now. Not because of your strength in war, but because of your restraint in the midst of it." Vasquez nodded but said nothing, and Torvald walked out into the corridor and back toward his shuttle, carrying with him the weight of a truth that the entire galaxy was about to learn. Humanity was not the monster the Draxharid had poked. They were something far more dangerous. They were the monster that could have destroyed everything and chose not to, but only if you gave them a reason to stop. 3 months after the day the sky burned, the human fleet arrived at Kashar, the throne world of the Draxhari Dominion, and the galaxy held its breath. 712 warships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, surrounding the dark volcanic planet in a ring of steel and light that blotted out the stars. And for one long, terrible moment, every living being on Kashar looked up and saw the sky fill with the shapes of human vessels. It was not an invasion force. It was a message. The siege of Kashar was not a battle in any traditional sense, because the humans did not attack. Not immediately. Instead, they simply sat there, in orbit, in silence, and waited. Their orbital defense suppression took 6 hours. Not 6 days, not 6 weeks, 6 hours, during which human electronic warfare systems disabled every Draxhari defense satellite, every ground-based missile platform, and every shield generator on the planet without firing a single gun. Kinetic round. They did it with code, with signal interference, with technology so advanced that the Draxhari defense networks simply went to sleep, like children being tucked into bed. And then the human fleet broadcast one final message to the surface of Kashar, and it was heard by every Draxhari on the planet, from the highest commander to the lowest laborer. People of the Draxhari Dominion, this is Admiral Chen Wei of the United Earth Defense Command. Your war fleet has been defeated. Your allies have abandoned your cause. Your empire's military infrastructure has been dismantled. We do not wish to harm your civilians. We do not wish to occupy your world. We have one demand. Surrender Warlord Sethrak to human custody to face trial for crimes against humanity. Comply and we will withdraw. Resist and we will wait. We have time. We have patience. The choice is yours. The message played on repeat, every 30 minutes, for 2 days. The gates of Sethrak's war citadel were thrown open from the inside. It was not the humans who dragged the warlord from his throne, it was his own people. A group of Draxhari officers, led by old Drothal himself, had finally done what they should have done months before. They walked into the throne room, stripped Sethrak of his rank insignia, bound his claws, and marched him out into the ashen light of Kashar's red sun. Sethrak screamed and cursed and thrashed against his restraints, his yellow eyes blazing with fury and humiliation. But Drothal said nothing as he handed the former warlord over to the human marines, who waited at the base of the citadel steps. The old commander simply looked at the nearest human soldier, a young woman with steady eyes and a face that showed no hatred, no cruelty, no triumph. Only the quiet calm of someone doing a necessary job, and he inclined his head. "He is yours," Drothal said. "Do with him what your justice demands." The Marine nodded and led Sethrak away, and that was the end of the war. But what happened next was the part that truly changed the galaxy. The Concord expected retribution. Every species in the assembly expected the humans to punish the Draxhari the way the Draxhari had punished their own conquered peoples, with occupation, with resource extraction, with the dismantling of their culture and the subjugation of their population. It was what any other dominant military power in galactic history had done, without exception, for as long as recorded civilization existed. The humans did none of it. Sethrak was taken to Earth and brought before an international tribunal, a court of human judges, operating under human laws of war that had been written and refined over centuries of conflict. And he was given a defense attorney and a fair trial that lasted 4 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict was unanimous, ordering an unprovoked attack on a civilian population, resulting in the deaths of 2,300,000 people. The sentence was life imprisonment, without the possibility of release. Not death. The humans had abolished the death penalty for war crimes long ago, not out of weakness, but out of a belief that killing a defeated enemy was too easy, too quick, and too merciful. Life in a cell with nothing but time and memory was, in their view, a far heavier punishment. The galaxy did not know what to make of this. The Thalani diplomat who had called for intervention months earlier stood in the Concord chamber and said, in a voice filled with genuine bewilderment, "They won. They had absolute power over a species that murdered millions of their people, and they held a trial, with lawyers and rules of evidence. What manner of species does this?" No one had an answer. On Earth, the rebuilding had already begun in earnest, being rebuilt from the ground up. Not as it was, but better, stronger, more beautiful. And at its center, in the place where the first bomb had fallen, a memorial plaza was constructed. A vast open space of white stone and flowing water, with walls that stretched in every direction. And on those walls were carved 2,300,000 names, every single one. Captain Idris Okonkwo stood in that plaza on the day it was dedicated, wearing his dress uniform, his medals heavy on his chest, and he looked at the names and felt the weight of them settle into his bones. He was tired in a way that sleep could not fix, tired in his soul, in the deep places where the memories of fire and screaming and the cold void of space combat lived. But he was standing, and that mattered, because standing was what humans did. A child tugged at his sleeve, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, with dark curly hair and wide brown eyes. "Are you a soldier?" asked. He looked down at her and managed a small smile. "I am," he said. "Did you fight the bad aliens?" "I did." She thought about this for a moment, her face very serious. "Are they sorry?" she asked. Okonkwo looked at the names on the wall, and then back at the girl. "Some of them are," he said quietly, "and that is a start." Halfway across the galaxy, Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka had already filed her resignation from active duty. She returned to Kyoto, to the house where she had grown up, and she sat in the garden for 3 days without speaking to anyone, just listening to the wind in the bamboo and letting the silence heal the parts of her that the war had broken. On the 4th day, she walked to the local school and applied for a teaching position. 6 months later, she stood in front of a classroom of 12-year-olds, and on the first day, she told them something that she had been carrying in her heart since the night she flew her fighter through burning debris in Draxari space. "We did not fight because we love war," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were not. "We fought because someone looked at our world and our people and decided we would not fight back, and that was their mistake. Not because we are violent, not because we are cruel, but because we love our home and our families too much to ever let anyone take them from us." The children listened in silence, and one boy in the back row raised his hand. "Lieutenant Tanaka," he said, "will anyone ever attack Earth again?" She looked at him and smiled, a real smile, the first one that had reached her eyes in a long time. "I do not think so," she said. On Arathale Prime, Torvon the Velishari historian presented his new treatise to the Galactic Concord. It was titled, "The Humans, a Study in Restrained Fury," and it was the most requested document in the history of the Concord archive. Within a single day of its publication, in it, Torvon wrote his conclusion, the passage that would be quoted in every school, on every station, in every civilization, for generations to come. The most dangerous thing about humanity is not that they can destroy. Every spacefaring species can destroy. It is that they choose not to. They had the power to reduce Kashar to glass and ash, and instead they held a trial. They had the right to demand submission, and instead they demanded only justice. They had every reason to hate, and instead they chose to rebuild. This restraint is not weakness. It is the highest expression of strength. And it is why, in the end, the galaxy does not merely fear humanity, it respects them. The final scene happened far from Earth, far from the halls of power and the memorials and the history books. On a refugee station near the edge of former Draxari space, a young Draxari child, a small reptilian girl with green scales and wide, frightened eyes, sat on a bench with her mother and watched as human aid workers moved through the station, handing out food and blankets and medical supplies. The humans had come to help. Not the Draxari military, not the politicians, not anyone who had power, but the civilians, the children, the ordinary people who had never asked for the war and had suffered because of it. A human woman knelt in front of the little girl and held out a warm blanket with a gentle smile, and the child took it with trembling claws and wrapped it around herself. "Mother," the child whispered, looking up, "are the humans still angry at us?" The mother looked at the human woman, who was already moving to the next family, still smiling, still kind, still doing the work of healing a galaxy that had been torn apart by one fool's arrogance. "No," the mother said softly, and there was wonder in her voice, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Little one, that is the strangest part." And across the galaxy, in the updated charter of the Galactic Concord, a new passage had been added, approved by unanimous vote of all 4,200 member civilizations, written in every known language and displayed in every Concord hall and embassy and station. It read, "You do not touch Earth, not because they will destroy you, because even after everything, they will help you rebuild, and you will never forgive yourself." The stars were quiet again, and in that quiet, the galaxy began to learn what humanity had always known, that the measure of a species was not in how it fought, but in how it chose to stop fighting, and what it built in the silence that came after.